Hi. So if you're watching this, there's been some technical difficulty, and I apologize for that. Quintus asked me to do an overview of the geography of the MEV supply chain today. To give some really quick context, PBS, or proposer-builder separation, is an auction mechanism to connect proposers who sort of own the rights to sequence a block with block builders who are these sophisticated entities that specialize in ordering transactions. In order to protect both parties, we put a relay in the middle, with this relay acting as the auctioneer. And then the other part of the supply chain that you might hear about is called MEV Boost, and that's essentially the software that the proposer runs that interfaces with many relays. Validators are sort of the backbone of the network. This map is from a project by Chainbound and the Ethereum Foundation. And it basically shows that validators are quite geographically distributed. The density in Africa and South America is somewhat low, but otherwise they have pretty good coverage. What about relays? At first glance, it seems pretty decent for their number. Lots of relays in Europe and on the east coast of the United States, and then also some instances in Asia. But in reality, there's sort of two classes of relays. Ultrasound and Bloxroot combine for about 85% of market share, meaning that all the smaller instances really don't have that much of an impact. For example, the relays in Asia likely account for only something like 1% of all blocks. So back to the full map. If we now sort of filter this down to only look at tier 1 relays, we see that they're only located in 2 locations. Those happen to be the economic centers of TradFi, and they happen to be well connected by fast subsea network cables. But there have been some steps to address this. One of those is relay proxies. This is a diagram from Bloxroot, and basically the idea here is that they create mirrors of their information streams and push those to different nodes around the world. These are just mirrors, they're not full instances, so they only broadcast bids and they don't accept them. But the idea here is that if you're a proposer in Switzerland, instead of connecting to the auction in North Virginia, you can just talk to their server in Frankfurt and only have 5 milliseconds of latency instead of 50 milliseconds. Now, of course, this doesn't magically reduce the total latency, but because the mirror gets a constant stream of blocks versus just a single response, it means that the variance in the longer call is less important. And also, it's much faster for the second stage because the commit reveal scheme is multiple stages of message passing, which would basically be like signing the bid and fetching the payload. So if we go back to the tier 1 relay map, and then we add some proxies, we see that once again, there's better global coverage. And in theory, if you're a validator throughout most of the world, you should have a proxy nearby. And we can actually look at some latency statistics to see the impact of this. So here's some data from Wonder Proxy, who basically spin up a bunch of servers around the world and then ping them. And if we look at the latency to the data center in North Virginia, we see that basically everywhere outside of the United States has latency of at least 50 milliseconds. Or if we look at French relays, we see that only European validators have low latency connections. We can do a superposition of those and see that although there's much better coverage, validators in Asia still suffer. But then when we add in the feeds from all the proxies, all of a sudden we have good coverage everywhere outside of Africa and South America and China, but I would assume that that's from their national firewall. Okay, so proxies give proposers a low latency connection to bid streams, but what does that mean for information flows? One thing that we can do is construct a simple model of the most latency sensitive order flow, and that would be price signals from centralized exchanges, particularly from Binance in Tokyo. And what we see in the traditional picture is that the total on-the-wire latency is comparable between the two sort of paths that information can flow, whether it goes through US relays or French relays. But again, we have this sort of big 50 millisecond call between the relay and the proposer for the North Virginia relay. So in this case, we can just add a proxy in France, and then for a minimal latency trade-off, we get more reliability in the call between the proxy and the proposer. But proxies aren't always a magic bullet, and we can check out some special cases to see that. So for example, a proposer in northern Japan, the price signal in theory should only be 15 milliseconds away. But because the auction still happens in North Virginia, the signal has to go all the way there and back. So this adds 150 milliseconds of latency, And I mean, it's still better than if there was no proxy, but compared to a relay in Tokyo, it can't really compete because like 150 milliseconds is just such a huge amount of time here. Or we can take the example of a proposer who's in Phoenix. Here they have a lower latency connection to the proxy on the West Coast, but the proxy is actually further from the relay than Phoenix is. So even though the proposer can get a more reliable signal from the proxy, in theory, the proposer could actually have more up-to-date information than the proxy itself. So with this framing, proxies are kind of a valuable tool for proposers, but actually don't provide that much value for builders and searchers because they distort the information path. The next thing we should do is sort of look at what the slot timeline looks like today. And the key takeaway here is sort of that the last 8 seconds is really inefficient. It's basically just very small message passing just to make sure that everything's going well and then doing some fork choice. By contrast, there's a lot that happens in the first 4 seconds of the slot, everything to do with the PBS commit reveal scheme and block propagation and execution. And because the only deadline here is at 4 seconds, we see different proposers and relays use this time differently, leading to what we call timing games, right? So we have this sort of blurry crossover. And if we look at some of the data from Panda Ops, we can actually see this really cleanly. So if we separate out Kiln, who sort of plays the most aggressive timing games, out from other honest proposers, we see that the profiles are just night and day. Kiln really pushes their timing as far as they can. But even inside these groups, there's a lot of nuance. So if we go another step further and separate nodes out by their geography, we see that nodes in the United States and Europe can handle Kiln's timing games, but the validators outside these regions struggle to attest on time. Sort of another interesting direction for geographic decentralization is what's happening inside of auctions themselves, and sort of how that changes the geographic incentives for block builders. And sort of what we've seen over the past 2 years is that auctions have gotten much faster. Back in early 2023, the median best bid at ultrasound relay during the heart of the auction led for 84 milliseconds. But by the end of the last year, it was down to just 20 milliseconds. In tandem, we can look at changes in bidding patterns. And what we see is that bid increments continue to shrink. And sort of when you put these two together, these auctions start to look like a PGA or sort of a shared private value auction where builders are just trying to respond as fast as possible to sort of maintain some margins on their blocks. And sort of when you have these incentives to read bids and respond as fast as possible, it shouldn't surprise anyone that it encourages co-location. So here we kind of tag bids from Titan Builder that went to both ultrasound and blocks or relays, and we can sort of compare the timestamps. And what we see is that there's sort of 2 distinct groups of bidders. So there's a subset on the right here that's much faster going to ultrasound. And there's a subset on the left here who's much faster going to blocks room. So this is sort of like inside of the auction evidence of co-location. The next sort of question would be like, how much of an advantage do they get? Well, that sort of depends on how much non-network latency there is in the system. And sort of what we've seen over the past 2 years is that non-network latency has declined a lot. So everything from optimistic relaying to faster block building algorithms sort of amplifies the returns from co-location. As you cut down the infrastructure latency, network latency becomes the dominant factor. And that's sort of the dynamic that we find ourselves in today, where we just have these very strong co-location incentives for all block builders. I think I probably won't read out these questions, but these are the topics that are on my mind today. So if anyone has any thoughts and wants to jam, please do find me. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all just have a great SBC.